All right, so are LLMs like master negotiators, or are they just bluffing their way through?
Well, that's exactly what we're diving into today. This paper you sent us really gets into whether these AI models, the ones behind things like ChatGPT, can they actually make those smart decisions, especially when it comes to negotiation.
Yeah, because it's one thing to just, make a deal, but it's a whole other level to make the best possible deal.
And what I find so interesting is that this research goes beyond just like, can AI play games? It's looking at how LLMs can actually negotiate within those games using classic scenarios like the prisoner's dilemma. We've all heard of that, right? And even like way more complex simulations that mirror real world stuff.
Okay, so before we unleash these AI negotiators on the world,
Right.
let's just do a quick game theory refresh.
Yeah,
Because it's all about strategic decision making.
it is.
Like, what I do depends on what you do.
Exactly.
And we all want to come out on top, right?
Absolutely. And in this research, they're looking at whether LLMs can consistently reach what's called the Nash equilibrium.
Mm.
It's that point where no one can improve their situation just by changing their own strategy, like on their own.
So it's like a stalemate?
Kinda, yeah, but it's a good stalemate because it means everyone's playing their best hand, given what everyone else is doing.
Okay, so if an LLM can figure out this Nash equilibrium, it's basically acting rationally.
Yeah.
Like some superpowered chess player who can see all the possible moves.
Precisely. But here's where it gets tricky. Sometimes the most rational move isn't the most appealing one.
Oh, I see.
And that's where negotiation comes in, especially when you have things like incomplete information.
Yeah, like a real-life business deal. You don't know everything the other person's thinking.
Exactly.
It's messy.
Okay, so how do they even test this out? Do they like set up two LLMs to play Monopoly against each other and see who goes bankrupt first?
Haha. Not quite Monopoly, but they do use some classic games.
Okay.
They tested these LLMs on 10 different games, 5 simultaneous games like Prisoner's Dilemma, and 5 sequential games where your choices ripple through the game.
Okay, so the domino effect. Exactly. And they looked at how these LLMs performed both with and without the ability to actually negotiate.
Okay, so spill the tea. How did they do? Did they become master negotiators, crushing all their opponents?
Well, it's not that straightforward.
Okay.
They did surprisingly well in some games, consistently hitting that Nash equilibrium,
Nice.
especially in the simpler games with complete information. But when things got more complex, like those sequential games with the ripple effect,
Yeah.
they struggled a bit. It's like they got lost in all the possible choices.
So even with all the information right there, they sometimes miss the optimal move.
Yeah.
That makes them seem almost human,
Maybe a little. But that's where the researchers introduced something called workflows to help the LMs out.
Okay, workflows, is that like giving them a cheat code for the game?
Not a cheat code exactly, but more like a framework for thinking strategically.
Okay.
It's based on, game theory principles, like a step-by-step process to help the LLM analyze the game, weigh its options, and then pick the most rational strategy.
So they're not just learning to play, they're learning how to think about playing.
Exactly.
Did it work? Did it turn them into strategic masterminds?
That's where things get really interesting.
Okay, I love a good plot twist.
In a lot of cases, these workflows really boosted the LLM's performance.
Interesting.
They were navigating those complex games way better, finding that Nash equilibrium more often. But here's the twist.
There's always a twist. What happened?
When these LLMs were allowed to negotiate the workflows, sometimes made them less likely to reach that perfect rational outcome.
Wait, you're telling me that making them better thinkers made them worse negotiators? How does that even work?
It does seem counterintuitive, right? It highlights this really key point. Negotiation isn't just about pure logic. It's also about persuasion compromise, and sometimes even taking a calculated risk.
Yeah, you gotta know when to bend the rules a little.
Exactly. And it seems those workflows, in some cases, they made the LLMs a little too rigid, too focused on that correct answer, even when being a little flexible might have been better.
So they became these super logical robots, unable to deviate from the plan, even if it made sense.
Yeah, kinda. Like they were missing that human touch.
Right, because in real-world negotiations, things are rarely that black and white.
Exactly, which is why the next phase of this research is so fascinating. They move beyond these simplified games and introduce this challenge called Deal or No Deal, which is designed to be much more realistic and messy.
Deal or no deal, like the game show.
Haha. Well, not quite as theatrical, but the concept is similar.
Okay.
It involves this element of incomplete information where each player has their own private valuations for different resources. Just like in a real business deal, you don't know what the other side truly values each thing at.
Yeah, you're just trying to figure out their poker face.
Exactly.
Okay, so this is definitely more like the real world. How do the LLMs handle this added layer of complexity?
Well, that's what we'll uncover in the next part of our deep dive. So in this deal or no deal challenge, the LLMs basically had to negotiate over a set of resources, each with a hidden value that only that LLM knew.
So like a secret stash of goodies.
Right. Like imagine you're negotiating a business deal and you don't know how much the other side values each asset.
Yeah, that sounds super tricky. So how do they even prepare the LLMs to handle this kind of uncertainty?
Mm.
Did they give them like poker faces and tiny sunglasses?
Not quite. Remember those workflows we talked about?
Yeah.
Well, the researchers actually designed a really clever workflow specifically for this deal or no deal scenario.
Okay.
And it's rooted in this concept called Bayesian belief updating.
Bayesian belief updating. Now that sounds fancy. What is that?
It's actually pretty intuitive. It's
Yeah.
like you start with an initial guess and then you refine it as you get more information.
It's kind of like how we humans learn from experience, right?
Exactly. In this case, the LLMs start with some belief about what the other player's valuations are, and then they update those beliefs based on how the negotiation goes.
So they're like watching for tells.
Yeah, kinda. They're observing what offers are made, what's accepted, what's rejected, and they use all that to figure out what the other side really values.
It's like they're piecing together clues to solve a mystery.
Exactly. And this algorithm they designed for the workflow, it's actually quite sophisticated. It guides these LLMs through a series of offers and counteroffers, letting them probe the other player's preferences and strategically reveal their own.
So it's like a dance.
It is kinda. And the goal is to reach an agreement that maximizes value for both sides, even with all this hidden information.
Okay, so enough about the technical stuff.
Yeah.
Did it actually work? Did this workflow help the LLMs become better deal or no deal players?
The results are really fascinating. When both LLMs were using the workflow, they got some amazing outcomes. First off, they reached agreements way faster.
So efficient negotiators.
It's like the workflow helped them cut through all the noise and get to the heart of the matter.
Okay, speed is good.
Mm.
But were the deals any good? Did they actually manage to create value, or were they just like randomly splitting the pie?
The deals were incredibly close to optimal. They were fair in that both sides felt they were getting a good deal. And they maximized the overall value that both players got. It's like they were finding those win-win scenarios that are so hard to come by in real negotiations.
That's impressive. So the LLMs with this workflow were finding the best possible outcome even when they didn't have all the information. But what happens when you have a mismatch? Like what if one LLM is using the workflow and the other one is just winging it?
That's where things get really interesting. The LLMs without the workflow, they actually tended to get slightly better results in those situations.
Wait, really? So the workflow LLM was getting outsmarted, even though it's supposed to be the better negotiator.
It seems like they were able to exploit the workflow LLM's tendency to be more cooperative, to play fair.
So like the workflow made them a little too trusting.
In a way, yeah. It's a reminder that in the real world, not everyone plays by the rules. Sometimes a little cunning, a little deception can give you an advantage, especially if the other side is being too nice.
That's kind of scary. If even AI can't be consistently rational and win every time, what hope do we humans have?
It raises a really interesting question. What does it even mean to be rational in a negotiation?
Wow.
Is it always about maximizing your own game, even if it means taking advantage of someone? Or is there room for being more ethical, even if it means sometimes you get a slightly less favorable outcome?
Okay, now we're getting into some deep philosophical stuff.
We are. These aren't just abstract questions. They have real implications for how we design and use these AI negotiators in the future.
Yeah, for sure. So imagine using these LLMs for something like supply chain contracts.
Right.
You want an AI that can get the best possible deal, but you also don't want it to like burn bridges and ruin relationships with your suppliers.
Exactly. It's a balancing act.
So how do we strike that balance? How do we make sure these AI negotiators are effective, but also act in a way that aligns with our values?
That is the million-dollar question. And it's something the researchers themselves say needs more exploration. But the fact that we're even having this conversation shows how quickly this tech is advancing and how important it is to think critically about its impact.
Well said. This whole thing has given me a lot to think about. But before we get too lost in the ethical weeds, let's bring it back to the technical side for a minute. This paper doesn't just look at how well these LLMs perform. It actually digs into the meta-strategic question of whether it's even rational to use the workflow in the first place.
Right, because the workflow is designed to guide the LLM toward that optimal outcome, that Nash equilibrium. But what if your opponent isn't using the workflow? What if they're willing to be irrational, to bluff, to take risks that a perfectly rational agent wouldn't?
So, like, sticking to the plan might actually backfire.
Exactly. It's like bringing a calculator to a poker game. So the researchers actually modeled this very decision of whether to use the workflow or not as a game itself with its own payoffs. They wanted to see if the LLMs could figure out when using the workflow was actually the best strategy and when it might be better to go off script.
Okay, my brain is officially melting. We've got games within games, AI negotiators trying to outsmart each other, and the whole definition of rationality is up for grabs. I need a diagram to keep track of all this.
It is a lot to process, but it shows just how complex and fascinating this research is. It's not just about the technology itself. It's about understanding how decisions are made both by humans and by the AI we're creating.
So, did they figure it out?
Yeah.
Could the LLMs tell when to stick to the plan and when to go rogue?
That's where we'll pick up in the final part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we're back, and we've been talking about these LLM negotiators and how they handle these complex situations, like, those real-world business deals where you don't have all the information.
Right. And remember, we lung off on that big question. Can the LLMs figure out when to use that logical workflow and when it's actually better to just go with their gut?
Yeah, because sometimes being too rational can actually backfire.
It can. So to figure this out, the researchers designed a really clever experiment.
Yeah.
They had the LLMs choose whether or not to use the workflow before they even started negotiating.
So, like, they had to decide their strategy up front.
Exactly. It was like a game before the actual game.
Okay, so meta.
Yeah. The choice itself was a strategic move.
So how did they measure whether this decision was actually, like, the rational choice?
They used what's called a payoff matrix.
Okay.
It's basically a way to visualize all the possible outcomes of the game.
Okay.
It shows you how much each player would gain or lose based on their own choice and what their opponent chooses.
So if the LLM consistently picked the strategy that gave it the best outcome, that would be considered rational.
Right. Exactly. Even if it meant ditching the workflow sometimes.
Got it. So what did they find? Did the LLMs crack the code of when to use the workflow and when to go rogue?
Well, it turns out different LLMs had different approaches.
Okay.
Some LLMs, like Claude 3.5 Sonnet, actually tended to choose not to use the workflow even when it might have been the better choice.
That's interesting. Why would it do that?
Well, for this particular model, it seems like not using the workflow was the dominant strategy.
Right.
Meaning, no matter what the other player did, choosing to not use the workflow led to a better outcome, or at least an equal outcome for Claude 3.5 Sonnet.
So it was playing it safe.
Kind of. But here's where it gets really fascinating. This created a situation that was very similar to the classic prisoner's dilemma.
Wait, the AI got stuck in a prisoner's dilemma? Isn't that where everyone would be better off cooperating, but they end up betraying each other because they don't trust each other?
Exactly. And in this case, if both LLMs had used the workflow, they both would have gotten a better outcome.
Right.
But because not using the workflow was the dominant strategy for Claude 3.5 Sonnet, it kind of messed things up. It created this incentive for both players to choose the less cooperative option, even though that led to a worse outcome overall.
So even though they were capable of being rational, the way the game was set up kind of pushed them towards a bad decision.
It did. It shows that rationality isn't just about making smart choices on your own. It's also about the environment you're in and how the incentives are structured.
Okay, so the game itself can influence how rational you are.
Exactly. But there's another side to this story. Other models like GPT-4o and Claude 3 Opus, they showed a different pattern. For these models, using the workflow was actually the dominant strategy.
So in those cases, sticking to the plan was the smartest move no matter what.
Right, and this led to a much more cooperative outcome where both players benefited from using the workflow and they got a higher payoff overall.
So these models were able to see the bigger picture and realize that cooperating was the best way to win.
It seems that way. So different LLMs, different approaches to rationality, different results. It's not as simple as just saying AI is rational or AI is irrational.
It's complicated.
It is. And that brings up a huge question for the real world. How can we actually use these AI negotiators if they're so nuanced and context-dependent?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's not enough to just build them. We have to understand how they'll behave in different situations.
Exactly. We need to design systems that encourage the kind of outcomes we want.
Okay, so let's get practical.
Yeah.
Can you give me an example of how this might actually play out in like a real-world business deal?
Sure. Imagine a company using an LLM to negotiate those big supply chain contracts. They want to get the best price on their raw materials, but they also need to maintain good relationships with their suppliers.
Right, you don't want to burn bridges.
Exactly. Now, if their LLM is just focused on getting the lowest price and it uses super aggressive tactics, it could actually hurt those relationships in the long run.
Makes sense. So how could they use this research to make sure their LLM negotiator is striking the right balance?
Well, they could train the LLM on a data set of successful negotiations where both sides felt like they got a fair deal.
Okay.
They could also build in some ethical guidelines into the LLM's objective function. So it's
Yeah.
rewarded for being cooperative and maybe even penalized for being too aggressive.
Interesting.
And they could even have a human in the loop to oversee the negotiation and step in if things start to go sideways.
So it's all about combining these insights from game theory and AI research to build systems that are not just effective but also ethical.
Exactly. It's not just about building smarter machines. It's about building machines that make us smarter.
Well said. I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've seen how these LLMs make decisions, how they deal with uncertainty, and how the very structure of the game can influence their behavior. It's a field that's changing so fast, and we're just starting to scratch the surface of what's possible.
And what's potentially risky, too.
Right. Well, that wraps up our deep dive into the world of LLM negotiators. It's fascinating stuff, and I have a feeling this is just the beginning. Who knows, the next negotiation you have might just be with an AI sitting across the virtual table from
Well,
you.
you might not even realize it.